quite all the retro
Yeah.
right now to get this. Yeah, really does.
I'm excited about
No
that. This
one's
is
getting
important.
excited.
Oh, it is
3 day
extraordinarily important.
But
And come on, I'm sure.
Hello.
Hi, Maureen.
Hi. So Rob and I were on the ferry, so he'll be here shortly.
All right.
He gets to get off first, doesn't he?
Depends on where you're parked.
this is, I mean, we have.
No, I thought he always was motorcycle.
Yeah, he was on his car.
He has a car.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
thought he never had a car.
yeah.
We're just saying, you know,
I thought
we're
you
just
never had
saying,
a
we'll
car.
set
It's
something
a
up
smart car.
for January.
Well, that's new.
No,
No, he had it during the election.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, how kind.
After
He
all
doesn't
the
use it
bragging
much.
about I don't have a car, yeah.
I think it's Marie Claire's.
Yeah, Marie Claire used to.
Oh, okay.
Engineering, we're down to
Because
a
I'm sure you
Yeah.
have a
for a
story.
candidate, but we need, this position wasn't anticipated when we set up the pipeline.
No.
You know, it's not totally adopted, there's just no place for it, so.
Yeah.
Large enough of recommendation, I'm sure.
Good.
An order on that.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, perfect. Moving ahead. Onward and upward. Well, you want to move after this?
Sure.
There we are, 401, all of a sudden, is Rob coming? I guess he is, eh?
Yeah, he's on his way.
Hello, David.
Good idea.
Thanks for coming.
You're welcome, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
How are you feeling, David?
Yeah, in here.
What did we, 3 months now?
About 6 weeks, I think.
No, that's not bad. That's about
Whenever
right.
October 21st was, because you were home in bed
Yeah.
on the election night,
Yeah,
I recall.
before that, a week before that, I think.
Well, let's get some of the formalities out of the way and keep moving on here. Greetings, welcome everyone. So we're going to open the committee of the whole and the approval of the agenda. Am I here? Someone move that? Thank you, David.
There were just the three later.
Oh, sorry. yeah.
Three on two items that were
Just so you know,
circulated by
round
email.
table items.
Yeah, are you all ready to go? You should.
Are they on table for the committee as well? I guess they are.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've got 22A, 22B, and 22C, obviously. Okay, is everybody okay with that?
I move adoption of the
You
agenda.
moved adoption, okay, and thank you, Maureen, and all in favor? Thank you.
As amended.
As amended. Yeah, thank you.
Should be amended.
So presentations, yeah, let's just move right up, you come on up, David, and again, thank you for coming, it's lovely to see you. Talk to us about asset management. Just, we'll probably let's wait a couple of minutes and see if Rob's gonna show up. I'm sure he'd be
Yeah, well,
interested.
he was on the ferry, he's also on the financial committee, so
Yeah.
I'll go look in the parking lot, and they can appear.
Yeah, see what's gonna happen.
People always appear.
We may have had a meeting now, did I? Is he on his own or two? Oh, okay, then he doesn't have to get changed or anything, then he should be here.
Drove one to get motorcycles.
Doesn't dare show up here with the car? Are we gonna get the slides are gonna get posted to the website?
Correct.
I don't necessarily, but I don't have
There's Rob.
There he is. Very good. We knew you were on that ferry, so. I'll
You
just-
are imminent.
Now I'll tell Lauren.
That's what happens, you get a break and everybody just scatters.
Yeah,
Can't wait to get out of here.
Top, my wife needs it, so I'll walk home.
Oh, Robin.
Yeah, of course.
See how dark it is? It'll be dark.
It'll be dark.
Now she's signing checks. I told her we're all listening.
All right. Well, so I'm so lost. That's here.
Yeah,
Okay.
there it is.
That's Marina's one second.
I was reading from the
On camera.
Show on camera. Needed reading glasses.
Well, thank you, David. Drum roll and pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship and Council. Thank you for having me here this evening. I imagine you have a big agenda, so I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. I believe about 30 to 45 minutes has been set aside for this, so
That's correct.
I'm going to try to keep the presentation to 30, 35 minutes.
Okay.
The agenda is to just give you a little bit of an introduction and report to you on the status of 5 key asset management deliverables. The last time I met with you a few months back, I reported on one of the deliverables, which was the asset management plan, but there are other interrelated work that we've been doing. So really today is really to give you an update. I'm going to cover a lot of ground and show you a lot of slides with a lot of information on them. The intention is not to go through all the details of every slide. I'm happy to come back. In fact, talking with Raj, the plan was just to give you an introduction to where we are in terms of progress. And we can dive deeper at a subsequent meetings. In terms of introduction, these are the deliverables. The asset management plan, which is there in the middle at the top, was the one I presented last time. Since then, we've done some data cleansing. Data cleansing is really about going back and looking at the data in the asset management plan. So I'm going to report on that in a moment. We developed with staff some process maps. So we documented some of the key procedures around things like complaints management and maintenance by internal staff and external staff, and I'll report on that in a moment. We also developed some draft policy principles for staff to review and for council to eventually also consider as well. I'm going to report on the risk framework. Working with staff, 59 risk hazards were identified and analyzed, so we'll take a brief look at that. Also, under level of service, 73 level of service indicators were identified in workshop with staff, and we're going to look at those. Asset management training has also been part of an ongoing service we've been providing, and we will be diving deeper into some more asset management training sessions with staff. In terms of a brief chronology, earlier this year, UBCM approved a matching grant. My firm was engaged in June 2019, so over the last 5 months we started off with the AMP, and then in the subsequent 4 months developed the additional deliverables through some workshops in September and October with staff. And all the deliverables were provided in draft in late October. Nothing has yet been finalized and will be hopefully early in the new year. So in terms of the data cleansing, the purpose of the data cleansing was to improve the overall confidence in the data. We showed you some graphs, some spending forecasts. The goal here was to ensure, well, how defensible and how accurate are those? Also to provide some deeper insight into the condition and performance of the municipality's assets. And just to help ensure that the asset management plan will help you make informed decisions moving forward. And also the goal is to move towards evidence-based and risk-based decision making. The scope of the cleansing was validating data to confirm where it's correct, filling in gaps in the data, removing duplicates in the data, removing any corrupt or inaccurate data. To put this into context, there were 8,000 rows of data in a master Excel spreadsheet. So 8,000 assets on the island were included in the asset management plan. And the goal was to move through all of those and make adjustments as necessary. And then to rank every single piece of data. So all of those 8,000 rows were ranked in terms of data confidence. How confident are we on this 5-point scale in terms of the quality of data? So that was part of the exercise. These are the results. There's a lot to absorb in this slide. The most important thing I want to point council's attention to number 7, which was the capital needs forecast. It was originally around 2.35 million. It went up to 2.4. So as a result of the cleansing exercise, the per annum capital spend averaged out from the next 10 years went up slightly, okay? Which is actually not that material of a change given the number of the amount of data we went through. And as you can see, there were some favorable changes and there were some unfavorable changes in terms of things like the average condition of the assets, the average age of the assets, the average risk scores. Bottom line is, if we look at the bottom line as what the monetary forecast was, it went up to about around $2.4 million average per annum for each year over the next 10 years. Yes?
What is the POF and the COF? Those four involved.
POF is an acronym for probability of failure, and COF is an acronym for consequences of failure.
Thank you.
If you bear with me, we're actually going to show you that in the risk report in a moment. Yes?
Yeah, if I can just provide some context on this slide. So when you're looking at the updated cost of about 2.4 million a year for capital, we currently have an annual contribution of 1.345 million. So we're about $1 million a year short on what we should be putting into the reserve for capital.
So you've got neutral beside 4 of them, yes, or 3 of them. So why neutral rather than unfavorable or favorable because they've gone up or down?
Because some of the scores are actually a composite of other scores. Without getting too technical, certain scores can change, go up or down, but they won't really have an effect unless they combine with another score. Now, apologies, Councillor, I know there's a lot to absorb in this slide. I just want to I want to cover the landscape, and then we can dive today or at a future meeting. So bottom line is the overall data confidence has improved. You can see the first flag on the left was before cleansing, the second flag on the right. So we're moving towards level 2 of the spectrum, towards the reliable range of data. Okay, so this is a sort of a high-level benchmarking picture, if you will, of the direction we're heading, which is positive. So the second deliverable was the risk framework, and this is about identifying all those events, all those things that could happen on the island, from a structure fire to a tree falling on the road and impeding traffic, to a water main, to an injury, all those things that could go wrong. What is the likelihood of them happening, and what are the consequences if they do? So we identified with staff 59 risk hazards distributed across 8 different asset classes. So on the left-hand side, you can see some of the risks for wastewater, such as a ruptured main due to third-party digging. On the right-hand side, you can see some solid waste risks, such as interruption of service due to vehicle age-based deterioration. We know that the solid waste fleet is aging, and the contractor is concerned about the reliability of the fleet. So you can see for each risk event, there's a cause. Okay, so it's important to know what is the cause of the event, because the severity of the event and the likelihood of it will vary depending on what's causing that event to happen. So there's a lot of interruption of service events, damage to property type of events, injury events, and what are the different causes. Here you can see some of the risk events for potable water and drainage, and on the right hand side some of the risk events for parks and recreation. Again, we won't be able to delve into all the details of all these, but what I wanted to demonstrate is that with staff, a fairly good suite of potential risk events were identified. And here are some of the risks for fire and fleet on the left and for IT on the right-hand side. Again, you can see things like a casualty event or a terrorist attack or a server failure, etc. So what we did was took all these events, 59 of them, and plotted them onto this matrix, which is referred to in best practice as a risk exposure matrix. On the vertical axis, on the left-hand side, we have the likelihood, the probability of the event happening. The more probable it is, the higher up on the axis, and on the horizontal axis, we have the consequences of failures. In other words, the further to the right we get, the greater the impact on the municipality. So in the top right-hand quadrant, we have those risks that are high probability, high consequence, and those are what we call the fix now events. The bottom right-hand quadrant are the lower probability but high impact. These are the things to be monitored. It's what we call the contingency type of events. So just to illustrate two events on the matrix, if we assume a small structure fire has some probability of occurring, but the consequences could be relatively small, whereas a sinkhole under the pavement due to a failed water main is less likely to occur, but the consequences could be greater. This is a simple conceptual illustration of two types of risk events, how they plotted onto the matrix. What we're looking at here is the 59 risks that were identified with staff. We can see that they're distributed, in fact, across all four quadrants. So there are some risks that were identified as being high probability, high impact, some that were high probability, low impact, and into all four of the categories. What we also did as part of the analysis was looked at which of these risks would be impacted by climate change. In other words, if increasing and changing weather conditions, would they have an impact on the risk? And most certainly they would. Where you see black bars, those are the number of risk events within each of the asset classes that could be affected by climate change. I'll give you a simple illustration. If the risk was a tree falls on the road and impedes traffic in both directions, climate change would increase that risk because you would have increased windstorms which would knock over more trees. So that particular risk would be identified as one being impacted by climate change. So you can see climate change affects almost every single one of the asset classes. The hashed bars are the ones where there's climate change may have a partial impact. Again, those four quadrants, so 12 risks fell into the fix now category, representing 20% of the 59 risks that were identified. And that category is the recommended treatment is capital investment and close management of life cycle strategies around those assets. 12 risk events fell into the monitoring category, and then 19 into the efficiency opportunities and 16 into the operational effectiveness category. So efficiency opportunities and operational effectiveness is really like looking at processes and procedures and the way the municipality operates. This is a dashboard with a little heat map indicating the average risk scores by across the 9 different asset classes. You'll notice natural assets has not yet been analyzed and included in this group. So there's a list of the total number of risks, how many were actually analyzed, what's the resultant risk score. Bear in mind that risk score depends on the number of risks that were analyzed. So if an asset class analyzed 10 risks, the risk score is based on those 10 risks. If only 3 were analyzed, the risk score is based on the 3. So in terms of where we are currently in terms of maturity in development of risk management practices, we're currently deemed to be in the sort of level 3 establishing a risk framework. Next deliverable, council, is the level of service framework. And this was really about identifying all the different stakeholder groups, what are their requirements, what are their expectations, what do we do in terms of service delivery, how do we measure how we're delivering services to meet the needs and expectations of different stakeholders, both internal and external. The purpose here was to help identify the optimal balance, if you will, between the cost of service, level of service, and risk of service, to consistently measure performance across the different asset classes, to ensure that awareness of stakeholder perceptions and requirements can be used to inform the continual improvement of policy and asset management objectives, and to just help develop appropriate decision-making criteria, and also to formalize communications with the island's different stakeholder groups. And we're going to show you in a moment a process. We did some process maps on complaints management, how are complaints received, how are they logged, how do we then respond back to the complaint, the status of the complaint. So that's an example of how other asset management deliverables tie into this. So just as we worked with staff and identified 59 risks, we identified 73 level of service measures. These are kind of KPIs, metrics or measures. And you'll notice they're things like number of complaints, average response time to emergencies, percentage of work orders completed. So here we're measuring how well we're performing against various metrics. So on the left-hand side, you can see a few related to water and fleet. On the right-hand side, you can see some related to solid waste. So for example, on solid waste, it's percentage curbside diversion rate per year, total tonnage of food and yard waste per year, and on the left-hand side, number of service connections fixed per year, chlorination levels at the start of the domestic water line. So a lot to absorb here, but there were a lot of time closely working with staff to identify what staff felt was important to measure. So this is a simple listing of what is being measured and a combination of what staff felt ideally should be measured as well. A lot of it depends on the quality of the data that's available to support these types of measurements. All these level of service measurements were grouped into these 7 categories: availability of services, reliability of services, safety, quality, suitability, sustainability, and cost effectiveness. You can see that a lot of the measures fell into category 4, quality. So 39% of the 73 measures are quality of service related, okay? And 17% of them are around safety. Just to give you an idea of the distribution of the different types of measures. Some of the measures are, setting targets is about minimizing something. So obviously if we want to reduce the number of complaints or the number of injuries or response times, we want to minimize. Some of the targets are about maximizing. Some of them are about optimizing. So there's different ways to set up the measurement framework. All of this, council, has been captured in an Excel workbook. So every one of these 73 measures is in a workbook with a series of columns showing what's the current score, what's the target score, how do you calculate the variance. And as part of the asset management training, we'll be going through with staff how the Excel workbook model, it's all an open book. So likewise with the risk, everything's contained in an Excel workbook. Just as with the risk, just as the risk events are plotted onto a matrix, so too are the level of service measures. The left-hand axis is the relative importance of the service to stakeholders, and on the horizontal x-axis, it's how satisfied are the stakeholders with the service. So in the top right-hand quadrant, we have services that are important to stakeholders, but satisfaction is low because we have a high variance to the target. So for example, if we have a response time to emergencies and we have a target that we're not meeting yet, but that service is very important to customers, that particular measure would sit up in the top right-hand quadrant. So for example, just to illustrate how this matrix works, we can see that measure number 9, average time to remove tree debris from road is considered important to stakeholders. They want to be able to get across the island, and staff considers the response time to be very good. So we'll notice that it's an important service to customers to resume traffic flow when a tree falls, and we are close, and we are basically on our target in terms of responding efficiently. So here is a visual of the 73 level of service measures plotted. You'll notice a lot of them are clustered down the left-hand side. What that means is approximately half of the measures are actually on target. So what that actually means is staff consider that you're meeting your current targets, but there are a number of measures that are off target. If you look at the top right-hand side in the red zone, there are a number of level of service measures that are actually very important, considered important to the community, but were not on target in terms of performance. This graph is a stacked bar chart just showing us across the 9 different asset classes, facilities, fleet, IT, parks, and recreation, how many of these measures are safety related, reliability related, quality related? So you can see that there's an interesting mix of different types of level of service measures across the different asset classes. The goal here is to come up with a nice balanced suite of KPIs. We don't want to have too many KPIs. It's very difficult and onerous to manage too many performance indicators, but to have a good balance, at least that we are monitoring safety, availability, reliability, and quality across the different service areas. I'm just going to jump ahead. Just as we did with risk, we looked at which of these level of service measures could be impacted by climate change. And you'll notice that stormwater and water, there are certainly a number of level of service measures there that could be impacted by climate change. Now, climate change wasn't principally in our scope, but we felt it was important to consider, to provide some sort of context to the current scope of work. So there are 4 quadrants. The one quadrant is to stay the course. 40 level of service measures fell into this quadrant, representing 54%. In other words, this is business as usual. We're doing well. We're on target. Let's just keep ourselves on target. There were 28 measures in category B that were identified as there's a need for improvement. We need to invest. We need to enhance the level of service. And this is done through things like capital investment, staff training, policy development, and process mapping. So you can see that there is a lot of good happening. This is not all a negative picture. There's a lot of areas in which we are on target, but there are some areas where we are off target, and there are ways and proposed actions to address some of those measures. Just as with the risk, here is a heat map indicating the areas in which the scores were lower or higher across the different asset classes. You'll notice, for example, water performance is a little poorer in water, given some of the water odor complaints, water supply complaints. So you can see it's well known on the island that water service is one area where there have been some challenges, and you can see it showing up right here in the heat map. This is a sort of a quantitative translation of what's going on the island. So in terms of level of service, we're middle of the road. We're on the journey, well on the journey to establishing a level of service framework, but there's definitely some room for improvement and to continue to work on that journey. Next deliverable was process mapping. This is about documenting procedures that staff are following. Staff are practicing asset management, but a lot of it's being done intuitively and informally. So we looked at documenting certain procedures, and the purpose for documenting processes is to ensure consistency and repeatability across the different departments, to ensure efficiency in operations, to help demonstrate due diligence, to facilitate staff onboarding. I'm aware that the island is considering, and in the process of, there are some staffing changes happening at different levels in the organization, and obviously having documented procedures helps with onboarding, staff training, and succession planning. Working with staff, we developed 5 process maps. One for maintenance work done by internal staff, a process map for maintenance that goes out to third-party contractors, a process map for how complaints are managed by staff, a process map on training and competency management, and a 5th one for ordering of supplies. Each of the process maps was developed as what's called a swim lane diagram, where the lanes represent different roles and the actual individual columns represent tasks. So here is, we only have time to show you one of the maps. This is the process map for complaints management. You will see that the first lane is the complainant who registers a complaint, and then goes to the next swim lane, which is administration, who receives the complaint, who then passes it on to, in this case, Parks and Recreation or Public Works, who would then investigate the complaint. And without spending too much detail, we then go on to actually classifying the complaint, prioritizing it, taking action on it, reporting up and following up with the complainant. And this is just a simple way to illustrate the steps involved and the different roles within the different departments that are involved. In terms of process mapping, again, establishing to competent, because there are already some well-established procedures in place on the island, and this is just a matter of formalizing and documenting some of those procedures. The next deliverable, Council, is a training program. There are two types of asset management training that are recognized. There is what's called awareness building training, and secondly, technical assistance training. Awareness building is really about helping staff and others understand some of the basic concepts of asset management. For example, what does probability of failure mean? Okay? What does consequence of failure mean? Technical assistance training is about using the municipality's data to actually apply the principles in practice. So take the spreadsheet, which will have all the probability of failure scores, all the consequence of failure scores, apply that in the Excel spreadsheet, and use that as a decision support tool. So there is some staff training has occurred on the awareness building side. We have not yet launched into the technical assistance training. That's the next key step to take place. And obviously how the training will also help identify who should be involved in which step in terms of updating the data. The goal here is to keep these asset management deliverables alive. They're living documents, help staff keep them current by updating them and using them on a regular basis. So in terms of a summary, if we look at the 5 different benchmarks, process mapping at the top, followed by asset condition. The asset condition score I reported to Council at the last meeting about a month ago that we're about a 3, between sort of just off 3 in terms of the, you may recall I mentioned the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, CIRC, has a 5-point scale for reporting on asset condition. Data quality has definitely improved dramatically, risk framework and level of service framework. So you can see that we're roughly in around about the 3-point score in the establishing range. The final item to report to Council on, and then I'll be wrapping up in 2 minutes, is the policy. So the asset management policy identified 9 principles that it's proposed that Council consider establishing a commitment to on the island. And the principles are listed on this slide. The text may be small and difficult to read, but I'll just quickly read the categories. So the first policy principle for commitment to asset management is regulatory compliance. This is already happening, and this is already captured in other policies, but it's reinforced here in the asset management policy. The second policy principle is a focus on level of service, and that's one of the deliverables we've been working with staff on. The third asset management principle here is to consider whole life costs. So when making decisions about acquiring new assets or replacing assets and maintaining assets, think about the whole life of the asset. Not just the next 5 years or 3 years or 2 years, but what do we need to consider over the whole life of the asset? The next one is to take an integrated approach. So this is being structured and coordinated across the different departments. Policy principle number 5 is about making robust, repeatable, and defensible decisions. Policy principle number 6 is based on risk-based decision making, and I demonstrated how the risk framework can support risk-based decision making. Policy principle number 7 is about making forward-looking and sustainable decisions. And this is really about considering the triple bottom line of the environment, people and community, and financial factors, how to find the right balance that optimize trade-offs between financial, social, and environmental considerations. Policy principle number 8 is a commitment to continual improvement, recognizing that we're on a journey and to continually keep working at iterative cycles of improvement. And policy principle number 9 is to make a formalized commitment to integrate climate change response, so climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies into asset management practices. So with that, I've concluded a 30-minute presentation, Council, and I'm here to take, I moved very quickly, and I'm here to take your questions.
Well done.
Thank you.
Anybody? So,
In the levels of service,
Yes.
under where you were talking, I think, about the stakeholders,
Yes.
maybe that was levels of service. In the IT area, do you consider things like, can the public download and print an agenda, as a stakeholder? Can they, how accessible is the website? That kind of thing? Is that partly what you do?
Most definitely, yes. Things like percentage uptime. How does your website go down? What percentage of documents can be accessed to the website? We looked at what percentage of documents are actually digitized. So under the IT category, we looked at hardware, software, and data. Yes.
Okay.
So
things
in
like-
short, your question, the answer is yes, that should be considered as potentially a level of service measure.
Okay, great, thanks, because I'm just concerned about, this is great. Just wanted to make sure that the public's ability to download things and get things out of your website is part of what you're looking for.
What we have to do, Councillor, is convert that into something that's measurable.
Yeah.
So the question is going to be, what are we measuring? Are we measuring the number of documents they can retrieve? Are we measuring, as long as we can translate it into a measurable
Well, I guess
statement,
this is
then you can do it.
This
yes.
is my question is, do you document, or do we document number of downloads or number of visits to the website, those kinds of things? I'm seeing some nodding over here.
Yes, and social media as well. So I did speak to, I can't recall the lady's name, but I did speak to, I think, somebody on the communication. And I spoke to about, how many people are tracking you on social media and the level of communication on social media, and that definitely falls into this, into this field.
Allison?
So on the first ones, I guess, on the asset management, or the risk thing, you had lumped potable water and drainage together. That was an odd lumping.
Yes, no, definitely. It's only because to try to fit it onto the slide, remember there were 59 risks. So I was just putting them onto the slide, but I agree they are very different categories.
So on the final report, they're going to be very different categories.
Yes, yes. In fact, what I've shown you, Council, tonight is a summary of over 500 pages of charts and tables and narrative. So we have a lot of information has been developed, and yes, that particular slide would be a clumsy categorization of information.
So in the level of service questions, you had importance to community as ranking. How did you ascertain that?
Okay, so at this stage in the journey, we applied general best practice. There are ways to get to refine that importance to customer. There are customer satisfaction surveys that you circulate. Those customer satisfaction surveys ask the community to rank different services, hiking, dog walking, cycling. And based on those scores in the customer satisfaction surveys, the services are ranked. But the other way they were ranked, the way we ranked them primarily was on the criticality score. So each asset was given a criticality score, how critical it is from a risk perspective, and that was used to rank the services. So something like water quality, fire response would be obviously ranked very high because Fire trucks are very critical assets. Water, good quality water is a very important asset, and others will be ranked down below that.
Okay, and then, from what I can see from the slides, and not having a chance to really digest them all, the services ranking only seem to be applied to where assets were involved. So we deliver services here, like processing, development applications for rezoning.
Yes.
Turnaround time in those services wasn't something that I saw in any of your rankings.
Correct, because I'm an asset management consultant, we're trying to translate everything to your tangible capital assets.
Yeah.
So whether it's a road or it's a building, but you do bring up an excellent point, Councillor, that there are some services that don't translate directly to a tangible capital asset, and they have not yet been properly captured in this framework. But they can be. The exact same principles can apply, yes.
Okay, last question. The process mapping, used to doing that from work many years ago. It's a fun exercise. But we used to have the little charts and they were all different shapes. How many process mappings have been done?
Well, we work with staff on 5 that we develop with staff.
Okay.
And what's important, and this is expressed in the report, is that some of those process maps are the same for each service area. But some of them would vary by service area. So that the actual number of process maps and further build out of those maps is something we're going to discuss with staff during the training, during the technical assistance training, yes.
So you're basically going to...
But the 5 that we cover some very significant areas. Maintenance, complaints management, staff training and competency management. So what we did was we tried to make sure that we at least captured one process map within a very significant domain of activities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go to David, please.
Thanks, a comment, an amazing amount of work, and I like the structure. But I'm just wondering about next steps. If you could go to your slide, which has where we are, your little pin.
Where we're going.
Oh, yes.
Go back to, there we are. Okay, so I see we're strong in some areas, a little weaker in others, but as you say, mostly around kind of the middle. So next steps, where do we go with all this info?
So next steps is, well, one of the key next steps is training.
Okay.
Staff training, 2 types of training, awareness training and technical assistance training. Technical assistance training, the reason some of these scores are not further over to the right is because these frameworks have not yet been embedded into the culture at Bowen Island. Once staff are actually practicing and updating these frameworks that we've given you and keeping them alive, then your scores are going to move over to the right. It's about operationalizing the deliverables that we've created. If they sit on the shelf and gather dust, then your flags are not going to move. If staff update these deliverables and refine them and use them to report to council,
Yes.
to write business cases, to support decision making, then you're operationalizing and you're going to move over on to the right-hand side. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
So training will kick off that process. Yeah.
So,
Um,
and then Maureen.
Well, mine is just, I was interested in your heat map
Yes.
there about the levels of service around, and I saw water was one of them and stormwater was the other one. So you're actually tracking, and I saw on another slide, I think you're already picking up the damage that was done in the winter storms last year. Are you using, like that sounds like a couple of
Actual
culverts.
events, yeah.
You probably don't know that detail very well, never mind, I was just interested to see that.
Yeah, he would be
Storm,
picking
that
them,
heat
that would
map.
be the culvert replacements.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We know that there's issues with culverts. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, a lot of the homeowners are not maintaining their own culverts, and those flood onto the roads. And
Right.
staff are spending time responding to failed homeowner maintenance. Okay,
Right.
so these staff. What we've tried to do is elicit all this insight from staff
Yeah.
and capture it in these frameworks.
Great, I
Yeah,
just wanted to know
yeah.
how up to date was it, or was it more theoretical, and it sounds like you're dealing with
No,
real
definitely.
stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely every level of service measure, every risk was through a dialogue with staff.
Right,
Yeah.
thank you.
But I will add though, some of the scores may need to be calibrated and adjusted, okay? But I think that generally speaking, we've got, the frameworks are there, we've tested them, they're working, they're showing scores that staff have said seem to be right, but it's a journey of making some adjustments.
Okay, thank you.
Maureen?
There's a mention of the level of standards committee in your presentation. In municipalities, ordinarily, who serves on a level of standards committee?
I'm not sure about that phrase, a level of standards committee.
LOS.
Oh, level of service.
Service.
Level of service.
Committee.
So,
Sorry.
level of service is a big topic. It's a challenging topic. It's one that every municipality is wrestling with right now. Who is the steward of that? I'm trying to see if I can understand your question and give you an appropriate answer. What we did was every service area identified a number of level of service measures of parks and recreation, fleet, IT, facilities, water, stormwater. And all of those level of service measures are being analyzed on a consistent framework. Which of the measures are safety measures? Which of them are availability measures? Which of them are sustainability measures? And the way scoring, as said, comes through the framework. But in terms of who's the gatekeeper or the steward of all of this is a very big question for Bowen Island Municipality to think about. Right now, asset management resides, I think, correctly with finance. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some municipalities it does, but I do think you're going to need to think about, as we operationalize this, you almost need to have ideally a champion within each service area. Because Parks and Recreation needs to have somebody who's going to manage and keep those level of service measures updated. Fleet is going to need somebody. Transportation is going to need somebody. So we're going to have to think about, through training and through operationalization, which person or persons collectively are going to manage this.
So staff committee representative.
Yeah. That's still something that's a step in the journey that we haven't got to that point yet. Yeah.
And then the other point is, when you were developing your work, you talked about having referred to the island survey to get some information on level of satisfaction and importance, perceived level of satisfaction and importance. And we just finished another island survey. It will be coming to council shortly. But it would be helpful, if this is appropriate to suggest, it would be helpful for you to make some recommendations about what some of the future questions on that survey might be.
Yes, that's a fantastic suggestion, because those surveys are typically eliciting qualitative information, and sometimes the questions are very broad, and we need them more specific and tangible. So we had to make some interpretation from a very broad question. They got a very broad response. How does it relate specifically to this?
Right.
So that, I'm glad you brought that up, and that's definitely something to think about for the next survey. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you did look at the community surveys,
Yeah,
the
yes.
last two we've done?
Yes. Yeah.
But the
Yes.
results of the most recent one are
Correct, but I will say though that was given a secondary focus. Our primary focus was criticality. Because criticality is more tangible and we were closer to it working with staff, and because the qualitative citizen satisfaction survey is more subjective and political, we tried to not make that our primary focus. Our primary focus was more from trying to be, if you will, as objective as we could. But it's difficult.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. That was
Thank you,
incredible
Council.
presentation, and there's a lot of information there. I think that the key is awareness at this point in time. I'm encouraged. I think we're heading in the right direction, so it's just a matter of getting everybody playing the same game here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Look
Thank you,
forward to the
Council.
next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so 2.2, Emma. And let's have a little chat about the short-term rental situation.
Handout, big one. Which will hopefully help follow along in the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so, good evening, Mayor and Council. We are at the end of the policy development stage for the short-term rental policy, and bringing the draft policy back to council tonight for adoption at the regular meeting. I just want to start with a quick recap of the situation on Bowen Island for short-term rentals. Our current land use bylaw allows for bed and breakfast, has always allowed for bed and breakfast. And it is the only form of short-term rental that is really allowed in residential zones. It is a home occupation, which means that the operator must be a resident of the dwelling, and at the same time that means the entire dwelling cannot be used for short-term rental. These bed and breakfasts have been operating in the community with no issue, as we know, and they are allowed year-round. The map shows the residential zoning on our island, which, as you can see, is most of the island. And in addition to bed and breakfast, we have some commercial short-term rental options. But as you can see, they are in much more limited areas of the island. And these allow for short-term rental year-round as well. In 2008, council permitted secondary suites as an accessory use to all residential lots. And in 2017, detached secondary suites were permitted. These suites were allowed with the intent to provide more diverse long-term housing options for residents of Bowen Island. Therefore, regulations were put in place that prohibited bed and breakfast on any property that contained a secondary suite. So this is just some background to explain the current regulations we have in the land use bylaw. In recent years, short-term rentals have been on the rise, particularly for entire homes. And in large part, this is due to popular online platforms such as Airbnb. And we're finding, and this is based on some data that we got from Post Compliance January of this year, where they did a scan of Bowen Island. Majority of these short-term rentals are for entire homes, and they are being operated, in many cases, by people that don't actually live on those properties. And in these cases, short-term rentals do provide significant income for the operators, which is often important to help meet housing costs. It also benefits the local economy and tourism, but it poses a lot of potential impacts for the community in terms of long-term housing as well as neighborhood character and safety. With this in mind, council directed staff to undertake the short-term rental policy development project at the beginning of this year, with the objective to establish a regulatory approach that would help to facilitate fair short-term rental use on the island while mitigating those potential negative impacts on the community. We started off this project with extensive community engagement for almost 6 months, and this was through a number of engagement initiatives and communication tools. Group staff has reported on the results of those as we went along, and based on all the feedback that we gathered, a draft policy was developed. And really we used the residents first approach, that is to protect the neighborhoods and long-term housing, and make sure operators will be accountable. As part of that, we are proposing to require business licenses for short-term rentals. This is pretty much the main regulatory approach taken by any municipality that is regulating short-term rentals. Business licenses also received a high level of support from all the engagement feedback. We also found that most people were agreeable to allowing entire homes to be used as short-term rentals, with the caveat of making sure they're regulated to help prevent those impacts on the neighborhood and help preserve long-term housing options. We also heard from a lot of existing bed and breakfast operators, many of them operating in full compliance of the current regulations, not causing any issues in the community, and want to make sure that the policy did not impact them and make it unfair for them moving forward. And of course, the measures that are being proposed in this policy were put forward to be sure that they were viable for enforcing, they're practical for implementing. The implementation involves three main parts: amendments to our existing bylaws, mainly the land use bylaw and business licensing bylaw, and also putting in place specific enforcement measures and additional taxation. Just to cover the few key components of the policy, I think the first one would be allowing short-term rental of an entire home, and this was being proposed as a seasonal rental use. This would be allowed as an accessory use to the principal use of dwelling on all residential lots for a total of up to 120 days in a calendar year, with up to 2 guests per bedroom. And then the second part of it would be business licensing. And here we're trying to keep the regulations minimal. We're mainly asking that all short-term rentals show the license number in their advertising, and that seasonal rental use, where an entire home is being a short-term rental, the operator enter into a good neighbor agreement. And that's really just to provide information for a local contact and make sure that they provide adequate parking, are meeting all the other regulations, etc. The other components, which are new, would be having online monitoring, and this will be subscribing to an external service to help provide us with data that will help to ensure compliance. And the last part is taking part in the municipal and regional district tax program, which is administered by the province. Tax revenue goes towards only tourism and affordable housing initiatives. And in this way, we can help to make sure that short-term rental use on the island will directly contribute financially to improving tourism management and affordable housing. Got a lot of questions around this 150-day limit, so just want to give a little bit more background on how that showed up in the policy. The whole intent was to make sure that short-term rental use of entire homes was kept secondary to the main use of that property as a dwelling for residents of the community. These are residential lots, and we want to make sure the short-term rental use maintain the residential character and intent of these lots. The way that most municipalities approach this issue is to only allow principal residences to short-term rental. In our case, we have a lot of properties that are not principal residences. We are a community of a lot of seasonal homeowners, part-time residents that rely on short-term rental income to help supplement their housing costs. So to allow for both full-time and part-time residents to short-term rental their properties, instead of having the restriction of principal residents only, we're putting a 120-day cap on the use of short-term rental. And this was based on several other municipalities, both in BC and across the world, that have addressed this issue with 120 days. There was another municipality that had a smaller limit, so this is not set in stone. It's just that it has been seen to be used to address exactly the same concern that we're looking at, maintaining short-term rental use as a residential use, accessory residential use. And in terms of the protecting long-term rental as an option for these properties, the point was brought forward that 120 days still helps to keep long-term rental as a competitive option. And just to illustrate that, I've put out the math. Based on our host compliance data, the short-term rentals on Bowen are renting out for roughly $150 a night. So for 120 days of short-term rental at that average rate, we're looking at about $18,000 income annually. And if we compare that to, say, a 12-month lease as a long-term rental for a property, that would be roughly $1,500 monthly rent. And that is, it really would depend on the property if that's affordable or not, but it was felt that it would still keep it competitive. So with that background, the draft policy was brought to council at the end of September, and council referred it to committees and an open house for comment, and that staff report back. The results of the referrals, Community Economic Development Committee wanted the 120 days to be reconsidered. Interestingly, within the committee, there were those that wanted it to be longer, as well as those that wanted it to be shorter. It was recognized that long-term rental housing is lacking on Bowen Island and very important to retain employees for the service sector to facilitate economic development on Bowen. And to make that limit any longer would really restrict long-term housing viability for that service sector. And then on the other hand, some people wanted to see the 120 days increased because they felt that 120 days out of the year wasn't enough to facilitate economic development and further tourism, year-round tourism on Bowen Island. They also asked that the other short-term rental options be clarified, so it's just more public communications on what the options are, and also to have public communications on the fact that a rezoning or temporary use permit can still be pursued for commercial short-term rental use in a residential area. They also wanted more details on the enforcement and fees, finding structure, and they really didn't like the term seasonal rental. They felt it was misleading that the rental was only allowed for one season. So they asked that that term be changed. The Housing Advisory Committee also had a lot of discussion around the 120-day limit, but in this committee, it was pretty unanimous that they wanted to see the 120 days reduced to be less, so that long-term rental would be more attractive as an option for a homeowner. They also wanted more communications to the public about the option for rezoning and temporary use permit for a commercial short-term rental use in a residential area. They also brought up a very interesting point that was frankly unexpected from the Housing Advisory Committee. They supported the use of short-term rentals in secondary suites. And as you recall in the background, the secondary suites were permitted back in 2008, 2017, with the express intent of providing long-term housing options. So short-term rental uses like bed and breakfast were not allowed in secondary suites. But the rationale that the Housing Advisory Committee put forth was that forcing people to only allow short-term rental in accessory buildings or their entire homes, excluding the option for secondary suites, meant that people that did not want long-term tenants were facing, the only option they had would be to decommission their secondary suites, take out their kitchen, transform it into an accessory building. And in essence, it would be removing a long-term rental unit out of the rental pool, regardless if they were going to use it for long-term rental or not, but it would no longer be available in the future for long-term rental. So they felt that allowing short-term rental in secondary suites would give people that option, flexibility to use their suites for short-term rental now and still preserve them for potential long-term rental use in the future. So it's very interesting. And then we came to the open house, also presenting the feedback that we've gotten from the committees to the public. We had 9 written submissions, all expressing fair to high support for the proposed policy. Most people that came in just really had concerns about the details and how that would affect what they wanted to do, and most were quite satisfied that the policy allowed them to do what they wanted. There was definitely a lot of comments on the 120-day limit. Unfortunately, the comments were quite split. Some wanted it to be longer and some wanted it to be shorter, for essentially the reasons that were already discussed. And a lot of written comments asking that short-term rentals be allowed in secondary suites. Incorporating all of the feedback we've gotten to date, the draft has been revised. We've changed the term seasonal rental to residential guest accommodation. It's definitely a bit more of a mouthful, but it is consistent with the existing land use term in the land use bylaw, commercial guest accommodation, which allows short-term rentals in commercial areas. So this is a lot more, I think, direct and less ambiguous than the seasonal rental. We are allowing guest accommodations in residential areas. A synopsis was also added, so this was a brief paragraph at the beginning of the policy that really summed up the key points. This was added because several sections were also added into the policy that made it quite a bit longer. So the synopsis was to give people a nice brief overview. Background section to really explain a lot of the information that I just presented. In terms of what types of short-term rental uses are allowed. The handout that was given is actually an appendix to the policy now, and also to emphasize the options for rezoning or temporary use permit for commercial short-term rental use in residential areas, the background on secondary suites and why the regulations are as they are, and the current situation on Bowen Island, how entire home short-term rentals do play a critical role in the guest accommodations on Bowen. Another large section was also added to further clarify the policy direction and the proposed regulation along with the supporting reasons. And this covered bed and breakfast, how we're not changing the existing regulations, why we want to propose business licensing and the types of regulations involved with that, as well as regulations for residential guest accommodation to help mitigate neighborhood impacts and help protect long-term rental housing stock. Why we are proposing to allow short-term rental use of entire homes and secondary suites. The rationale behind the 120-day limit, as well as more details on enforcement fees and fines, and the reasoning for taking part in the municipal and regional district tax program. So I think this is kind of just a recap of all the information I just presented, but that pretty much culminates in the current revised draft that you have before you. That's the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. That's an amazing initiative that you've been dealing with here, and it's very controversial. And I don't know, I think we found some nice middle ground here. But I'll start with Maureen and then over to you.
I like that you found an alternative for the seasonal rental, and it's elegant, clearer. The good neighbor agreement. Good neighbor agreements always sound a bit creepy to me. You know, just the term, good neighbor. So could you explain what exactly is in a good neighbor agreement?
We have yet to bring forward one. It would be part of the bylaw amendments that we'll be bringing to council. It would be part of the amendments to the business licensing bylaw. There'll be a schedule to the bylaw. So it is yet to be drafted. There are existing ones for several other municipalities. They're all different. So in our case, I think the key things that we want to ensure are information for local contact during operation of the short-term rental, compliance with our existing bylaws. We want specifically spelled out how much parking they're providing, how many guests they're allowing, just to make sure that what they're applying for in the business license actually complies with their bylaw.
Is there any consultation with neighbors?
Yes, well, like I said, it will be ultimately up to council what you want to adopt for the good neighbor agreement, but right now, we are asking, the general points that we would like in the agreement is that they share the local contact information with their neighbors.
Okay. I'm wondering if an alternative term might be possible that sounds less intrusive. If it's primarily documenting contact information and agreeing to compliance with bylaws. Something else perhaps
I think
might go down better.
we have existing good neighbor agreements, right?
Yes, but they tend to be controversial. I'd like this to be less controversial than some of the good neighbor agreements that we have, and because it's going to apply to significantly larger group of people
So
as
like
well.
something utilitarian, like residential guest accommodation agreement?
Yes, you got it, yeah. I mean, I think that just sounds much more benignly bureaucratic.
I find the good neighbor thing is actually quite nice, and that they have to be a good neighbor. I mean, that's the direction it's going. I don't see anything creepy.
So just on that point,
Hang on.
Hold
no,
on.
I just want to add something to good neighbor agreement. There's a lot of things being asked for in here that have nothing to do with a good neighbor agreement.
Okay.
So I like Maureen's terminology better. Under the list of what would be in a good neighbor agreement, there are things in there that have nothing to do with a good neighbor agreement.
They're
Okay.
primarily administrative in nature,
Exactly.
and that's why I think an administrative term would be more appropriate. I like the way you presented the rationale for the 120 days, showing that balance between the income earned through renting to a tenant versus renting on a short-term basis. The point that came up in this is my last point, the point that came up in the housing committee, I think took the housing committee by surprise as well. The argument developed to a point where we thought, oh, and the bottom line was we shouldn't be taking kitchens out of anything because it retains the flexibility of use for the unit, whether it's going to be for long-term rental or short-term rental purposes. And I'd be interested in further discussion on that, President Council. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Maureen. That's gonna look
Yeah,
good.
thanks, Gary. And thanks, Emma. A lot of nice work here, and I recognize that you're trying to balance, on 120 days, you've got people on one side and people on the other. So my 2 points of 120 days and the secondary suites, what Maureen was just talking about, because I couldn't for the life of me understand that. But I'll come to that in a sec. 120 days, I was, well, first of all, I like what you did with the revenue, but that is gross revenue, and it would be way more expensive to run a short-term rental operation, so the net revenue actually would be quite a bit less, to make, if you want to make them balanced. And I was sympathetic to the letters, where you've got someone who has a house that would not be part of the long-term rental because they'll be using it from time to time, and 120 days would just mean they can't use it as much. I was sympathetic to that argument. So I'd be sympathetic to increasing that a little bit to deal with net revenue rather than gross. It's a possible way of doing it, but I like your effort at doing that and noticing that other jurisdictions have used that method. The other one, and Maureen, you're going to have to explain this better to me. If someone's got, we put secondary suites and detached, within the house and detached deliberately to provide long-term rental. And so if someone's renting it long-term, we don't want them to suddenly switch to doing it short-term because it could give them more money. So I'm sorry, I'm not grasping the issue.
Daniel?
Yeah.
If I can just talk to that for a bit.
Yeah.
So somebody goes to, so if we were to adopt it and say it's not allowed in secondary suites, and somebody were to buy a house that has a secondary suite in it, we would say, okay, you can't use that as a short-term rental thing unless you decommission it. Essentially, it would mean that they took out the kitchen and they made it just part of the house. They could then use it, the bedrooms,
That's what
as a short-term rental.
As a B&B.
A B&B,
As a B&B,
then it becomes
yeah,
as a B&B.
they-
Switch it to a B&B.
Yeah, so they could do that, or if it's in a, same if it's in an accessory building, it's a detached secondary suite, same thing, they could decommission it, so now it's a bed and breakfast, I'm renting a bed and breakfast, I'm not I'm not renting a short-term rental out of the, I'm not renting a, yeah.
B&B.
Residential
Yeah, no,
guest
okay, yeah, residential accommodation out of a detached secondary suite, but I'm renting a B&B, and the housing committee felt like it was better to say, not make people go through that step, and better to leave it as a full suite, and that they may be using it, renting it short-term for now, but maybe life will change and they'll want a long-term tenant, or the next owner will want a long-term tenant, so that was their.
I guess I'm gradually understanding it, but it'll have to be really carefully explained to the community. I can just imagine a whole lot of people going berserk about this.
Me too.
Yeah.
So, I
When
mean,
I read it, I thought, just a minute, Emma must have meant cannot, not can. I just didn't get it at all.
I guess also, one thing I'll add that wasn't really included in the report, there were significant amounts of comments that were submitted from people that own secondary suites that have never had a long-term tenant, or they hadn't had a very bad experience and have no desire to rent long-term moving forward for a number of reasons, either bad experience or they want to keep the suite for their family and friends.
Right, sure, I get that.
And so for their life situation in the present, there is no way that they will use it for long-term. But on the other hand, they would really appreciate the income and also helping to add to the supply of guest accommodations on the island. But in that case, where they feel strongly about being able to use it for short-term rental, they would have to take up the kitchen. And a lot of people that wrote in, they didn't want to, but that's the path that they would have to take to fit their life situation.
Okay.
Just for clarity, so they could use it as B&B.
Yeah, I didn't get the B&B part. I would agree with the kitchen ownership.
Okay, that
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. I'm delighted to have some regulation coming forward about residential guest accommodation, because it's been exploding not just on Bowen Island, but all the other islands in the Islands Trust area. And I have a couple of questions. I actually support the idea of the flexibility and the idea of bed and breakfast in secondary suites, because I think people need the flexibility, and we're looking at a long time. So a family, for example, might have a change in circumstances, and they might need, or they might move down into it to rent a big house or something like. I think families in this era of affordability crisis for housing might need that flexibility, and I also think it helps bring stability into neighborhoods. And this is one of the challenges, I think, is I want to keep the sense of residential neighborhoods. I don't want it to turn into commercial and be a way of losing the neighborhood character and the special quality we've got on Bowen of being able to recognize people when you walk by them on the street and look them in the eye and smile, which people do, more than in the city. And this brings me to my, by the way, about that flexibility part, I've read some planner articles about that in other cities too, saying, I used to think that, but now I'm thinking. So it's not, anyway, a little bit of research, I can pass some articles around. This brings me to the 120 days, which I think is too long for stable, secure feeling neighborhoods where you know your neighbors, and or where you at least recognize the people and smile at them, and where the guests get a sense of connecting to Bowen Island, or their experience includes people in the neighborhoods or on the beaches, right? Because I think a lot of times people bump into each other on beaches. I know people who, I've met somebody who I'll just call Beach Man. I never got his name. I met him out at Kate's Beach, way out at King Edward Bay, and we had a nice chat on the beach. And he'd been coming to Bowen for like 10 years, same house every year for a month, or 3 weeks or a month. And he felt himself part of the Bowen community, was happy to chat and that kind of thing. So compare that to some other people I know, a couple, older couple, sharing a house, renting, and they had to get out of that house for 2 months in the summer. That was a hardship for them to have to get out of that house for a full 2 months. They can do some traveling, and they're going, now what do we do? We can visit family for part of the time. 2 months is a long time. 120 days is twice that. That's 4 months. That's, I think, disturbing the stability of neighborhoods, the ability of people to live long-term rental on Bowen Island. I think it might be possible for the landlords, but the tenants, I think, are going to need to churn. And it doesn't line up with school times and things like that. Anyway, I just, I think 120 days is too long, but I'm gonna end with a question. Is that 120 days per unit or per property? Assuming people have both. Because
That's a good question.
how much churn in a neighborhood?
Yeah, putting one line into the policy to give us some direction on that. We've discussed it in planning, and more so for being able to implement and enforce. It would be the cleanest to have it by unit.
Right, in which case then I really think 120 days is too long, because that could be 2 units on a property that had a secondary suite and a detached secondary suite. With new people coming and going all the time in a neighborhood, I think that's disruptive. When children like to look out and see, oh, I recognize that person with the dog. And seniors and neighbors, right? That's what neighborhoods are. It's residential. So that's my concern. I'd like to see it 60 days.
All right, Mike?
A couple of context question for you first. Given that you've been working with host compliance, just how many short-term or residential guest accommodation units do you think we're dealing with on Bowen Island? What's the number?
It was 123 in January.
Okay.
Online.
Let's take that as a rough number. Okay. That's a piece of information that's really interesting. A couple of things. There's a suggestion in this report that if you reduce the 120 days, you're going to increase the long-term rental. I don't buy that. The Tofino experiment didn't buy it. I just don't think that will hold water, and it wouldn't suffer critical review. In terms of your 18,000 versus 18,000, your net versus gross, as pointed out, please do not go public on that, or else you're going to get everybody operating a residential guest accommodation coming to you with their numbers. And I absolutely assure you that if you're going to offer short-term rental accommodation, call it what you like, it certainly comes with a cost. And by the way, that cost is often to the benefit of local people getting employment. Right? So please don't flag those numbers, because I think you're going to be very uncomfortable with the result. Working with host compliance will give you a lot of information, but I think you'll agree that per unit, host compliance will not be able to flag for you when each unit has reached 120 days. Am I right? They will not be able to tell you when each unit has reached its 120-day limit.
Not with the basic service package. And no, we're not counting on host compliance for that data.
Now, look at 120 days, 4 months of the year. If I'm offering this type of accommodation for 4 months of the year, well, surprise, surprise, I'm more than likely going to put it on the market somewhere around about June, July, August and September. And why? Firstly, it's because it's the easiest to sell, and it will give me the highest yield. So I will sell into a high period of the year when we are already billed, when we are already doing, in this marketplace, good business, and some people would say more than good business, and some people would say we've turned it into a gong show down at the Cove. Now, we have tasked Tourism Bowen for the last couple of years, and we've said you need to be strategic. You need to take the wealth and the affluence that a tourist market can bring, and you need to be able to spread it over the year, right? You need to be able to develop those shoulder seasons. Well, there's not going to be much motivation if you've just lost 2/3 of your year to develop the shoulder seasons. So for me, one of the most difficult things about this numerical limit, which can't be monitored and can't be controlled, is that it's working against one of the key objectives, which is to develop our business into more of a year-round business. It's running countervail to one of our major thrusts. That is really sad that that would be the case. And you know, quite honestly, if someone has just bought one of the things that's got general acceptance is our business license. Well, if you're going to take 2/3 of the year away from them, are they going to come and ask you for 2/3 of a discount on their license? Because you've just hobbled them now to one day out of 3 or whatever it is, because they can't operate year round. I have great problems introducing something not only that cannot be monitored or cannot be controlled, but will be frustrated by human nature because people will not leave their good businesses unattended, and also works against one of the most important principles that we're after, that is to make our business more year-round and keep employment more year-round and provide certainty of employment over a longer period of time. This is retrograde, and it's more troublesome by the fact that it's unmonitorable. And I know how hard it is, and I compliment you for what you have done and the way you have presented it. But this 120 days issue will not go away because all the people in the industry read the letters that we've received. Because they are structured letters, they are not. They are people who've sat down and presented a sound case. Right? This is a very complex issue, and I don't envy you, please believe me, and I thank you for having to deal with it. But this 120 is going to be really, really, really difficult, and I hope we can find a way around it.
Okay.
You think it should be
I need to go to Daniel first and then one.
Okay. I've been on the list for a while. I'm
Sorry.
skipping it. But go for it.
I just wanted to respond quickly. So one was during our consultation, and one of the reasons for allowing some form of short-term rental in the dwelling that's not just the principal residence is the people who contacted us and said, well, we live here part of the time, right? And a lot of them saying, well, we're here in the summer, we're here maybe at holidays, and we're not here through the year, so we want an opportunity to make it available then. So the focus isn't on somebody has the house and it's just vacant the whole year, because our policy and our current bylaws all say, well, then it has to be a full-time resident. You know, so your options now are rent it out full-time or live in it when you use it, and then it's empty is currently what's under the bylaw. So, you know, we're almost look at the opposite and we'd say, well, currently people use them in the summer and they're empty the rest of the year, and how do we fill it throughout the rest of the year? And also say that, you know, currently our bylaws don't allow any short-term rental. So for somebody to say, I need to be able to continue my business
They allow bed
plan.
and breakfast. They
We
don't
allow bed and
commercial
breakfast,
guest
yes, but so we don't allow the short-term rental of an entire dwelling year-round. So for people who say, this is my business plan, is to have this operating year-round, and now I'm being restricted, well, that's not a legal thing within our bylaws, and we're trying to find a way to allow that without having that impact on it. But so for existing businesses, or people say, well, I want to purchase it and run it as a business, well, that's not allowed in our bylaws right now.
I'm just going to go down and then back.
Just really quick, Michael, about the monitoring part, it is possible, it's just not part of the base package, and it depends how much council wants to spend on the monitoring service. Post compliance, we have data that actually shows the average number of nights per listing is 58 nights. So 120 days is far greater than what the data has been shown. So 58 nights is the average number of nights that a listing rents out per year.
And that's from Post
From the
Compliance.
online data.
We paid for that information.
That was their complimentary scan.
I'd like to see that verified.
Maureen?
The higher level of service from house compliance, do you know roughly what that would cost to enable monitoring?
Not off the top of my head. The base package is already $4,000 US.
And
And every add-on is additional, so I don't have off the top of my head the price list.
okay. And with all of this discussion, bed and breakfasts are still operating under the usual rules, which is all year round. Yeah. So the 100, just to make sure, I'm going to belabor the point, the 120-day restriction does not apply to bed and breakfast. Thank you.
Okay, Rob?
Okay, yeah, just a couple things. Thanks, Emma. Very tricky following in the commercial, residential, like where do we slot this in, and I appreciate your rationale around that. And you know, for me, on this, like where do we go, how far on the 120 or whatever, for me, the big issue is this is not, we're not setting this up to create commercial enterprises. We're setting this up to maintain our long-term rental, but also allow homeowners an opportunity to potentially recap some money on times where there's nobody in the house. So it worries me when we start talking on commercial and driving tourism and all that. That's not what these residential houses are for. Okay, so I do think you're falling into a nice little spot there. You know, the 120 basically is economically, if we believe the numbers, is a neutral thing. So we're economically not encouraging long-term rentals, which is a bit of a worry to me. But I'm willing to live with the 120 if that's sort of where everybody goes with. I actually at the start was reluctant to even go into this, and I was surprised that some of the short-term rental operators, especially the ones doing a lot of it, wanted this to come forward because, but having spoken with a lot of some other jurisdictions, and I sent around a letter to council on Prince Edward County, where my brother runs a bed and breakfast, and he said the worst thing that's ever happened to them is they were put on the top 10 of the Airbnb list, and it decimated their tourism economy. Hotels shut down, his business is down, restaurants saw a drop in business because the Airbnb people are just taking in their own food, they're not going out to restaurants. So I caution around the tourism side. There's been, in Prince Edward County, you can go look at it, they're retroactively now trying to fix the problem because they didn't go into some kind of regulation. So I'm more supportive now of us moving forward with regulation. And I think not doing it could potentially be a big problem. You're seeing a lot of backlashes against short-term rentals in the States as well, and I don't want to see that happen here as well by overstepping and creating a lot of issues. Councillor Fast brought up people having to move in and out of their houses, and that concerns me. We actually had a letter come to all of us where somebody was basically saying, oh, you can live here during the week, but on the weekends, you gotta hightail it because that's when I want to rent it out. So that's a concern of mine if that starts happening. So I think that's something that we may want to keep an eye on and look at, because I don't want, you know, renters I think deserve to have predictable rental units, not just sort of couch surfing going in and out of units based on when the owner wants to rent them out. I don't know how we're going to regulate that, but
That would fall under the Residential Tenancy Act.
okay, so that's something that's already in law,
Yeah.
so that's good to know, thanks. Just a bit about, so now we're going to get into, you know, about the regulation and what are our expectations. So one of the examples is the parking side of things. And I used to come to Bowen 10 times a year, every year for a decade. Never, ever, ever took a car. I usually stayed at the old dorm or, you know, the Union Steamship Company where there wasn't parking, you know, which is fine, right? And I think we need to be encouraging people to come over here, not with cars, and encouraging the downtown market, where half the people don't own cars anymore, to come here. So I want us to think a bit down the road and not sort of this sort of old school, you have one unit, you have one parking spot, right? And that, because that's going to negatively impact short-term rentals in the Cove, where we don't have those extra parking spots. And if somebody is doing a good job at attracting people that don't take cars, that's an extra bonus to us. So I mean, the end all goal is that people aren't driving cars and parking it in their neighbors or on the road. So I'd much rather have wording around that. For instance, all transportation parking is done on site, instead of being very prescriptive and saying, no, you need to have that extra spot even if it's not being used. Am I making sense with that? So, I mean, I see the rationale for the on-site parking, but but the goal is not to have people parking off the property. So I think we should have that written that way in the legislation, so we give people a bit of that flexibility, and we encourage people to come over without cars, instead of just assuming every person who comes is gonna have a car with them. I think that's it. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Awesome.
So the policy itself, I think, still needs some work. There's things in it that really aren't policy related, and Daniel had a great wording this afternoon, and I can't remember, I didn't write it down, and you can't remember either, Dan. So there's policy versus, future actions, and so I don't think the policy is ready to be adopted tonight. And also terminology. B&Bs and residential guest accommodation are operated for profit or gain, so that makes them commercial. So I'm still having a real problem with, saying SDR and not saying B&B, and saying that B&Bs aren't commercial. They are commercial operations. Now, a question on the listing. The data said 123, and Daniel printed me off the map that the staff presentation got, which I think we don't all get by email. It said 123 listings representing 108 unique rentals, which I guess you can advertise on more than TripAdvisor and Airbnb and stuff like that, correct?
Or one property can have multiple units.
Well, it's talked about unique rental units, so to me, if you had 3 units, then that's still, so that needs some question, but I guess the question is on the 108, have we done any analysis of what they are?
In terms of whether or not they're entire dwellings?
Yeah, because you said the majority of them, but what's majority? Does that mean half of the 108 is so 54 of them are the full dwellings rented out, or?
We have the information that was provided by host compliance, and they identified 84% as entire homes. So they don't use the same technical definition that we use for a dwelling unit. So when they say their entire homes, I believe it has its own private entrance. So it could be a suite. Yeah, it could even be an accessory building.
Okay. And then how did they come up with, you said 58 as being the average? So then my other question is, if you list with Airbnb or whoever the other Expedia or whatever, is that exclusive? I mean, you can't list with anybody else, or if you list with them, you can't rent it out directly yourself?
No.
I'm not.
I can answer that question. If you are listed with any of those carriers,
Yeah.
in fact, you will find, if you go on several of them, you can go to booking.com and you'll find the same property
Yeah, well, I've
listed
done
on
that,
several.
but can I just list it myself?
Yes.
And have my own website to take the reservations
You list it
directly?
yourself, and what will happen?
Okay, Michael, that's my question for
Okay.
you. So that 58 average nights is probably really low, because if I can take a direct booking off my website, why would I pay a commission to the other guys to do it? So it's probably the extra. So they've got the repeat customers that come back every year, and they'll book directly or tell their friends, and you'll book directly through the website. Especially if it's, been recommended by a neighbor or somebody in a small island, them. Yeah, so I would think that 58-day average use might be low, but we haven't verified that. And I'm not sure whether we really got a huge attendance at the open houses or the survey. I mean, we've got, 2,000 adults or so, and if 200 of them responded. I know it's statistically valid, but I don't know that it's really, And the other, I guess, is how many actual complaints have we really had about a commercial guest, a house being rented out?
for one property, just for instance, when I was managing wildlife services, I got one almost sometimes once every other week or sometimes.
For one particular property.
Yeah.
So there's the guys that make it bad for everybody, the rotten egg that wrecks it for everybody else, but 2% is
So there are problems.
high school principal
For sure.
used to say. So there's problem ones, and everybody else is really probably operating a generally good operation.
I can say for sure.
So-
We definitely have problem ones.
In a way, I'm wondering if we're doing an elephant gun to deal with a mouse. Because commercial guest accommodation is not allowed except in the park and in the code. So if there's a bad actor, just enforce the bylaw, shut them down. I mean, do we
Well,
really?
your business licenses, that's why that's.
That's what, yeah, and they don't have but business, pull their business license. But the whole problem we've got is we want these people to have a business license, and they can't apply for a business license if it's not a legal use in the land use bylaw. So I'm trying to balance that dilemma.
I think the issue that Daniel pointed out, which is that it is currently illegal to rent out whole homes, and all sorts of people
So
do
they can't
that.
get a business license.
And I mean,
Yeah. I'm just
so
saying,
this is
it's
part
not
of dealing with
but it's not a big problem impact to neighborhoods and everything. It's a couple that are doing it. So maybe we just allow everybody to have residential guest accommodation in all neighborhoods and deal with it if we can pull their license if they get 3 complaints.
Well, that's what we're
And
doing.
then shut it down, but no, we're not, we're putting in, that gets me to my next point, David did, is 120 nights. You know, I'm not sure that it's gonna be difficult to enforce, it's gonna be difficult to figure out whether they've used 120. So why complicate it? And then, you said other communities use the 120, and I apologize if you've already provided us with that information, but who uses the 120?
In BC, Revelstoke and Nelson. LA has also implemented it about a year ago, Paris 2 years ago.
Okay,
That's
that's communities that are like us, the Revelstoke and Nelson.
Well, they're similar in that they do have a high proportion of seasonal residents. And that's why they went that route as opposed to the principal residence restriction.
But what about Whistler, Tofino?
I think we're all
Quality.
familiar with Tofino. So they've taken a very different approach.
Yeah.
And Whistler as well. Whistler is mainly a tourist accommodation in town, and they're zoned accordingly. So most of Whistler has zoning that's specific for tourist accommodations.
And then David raised my point that I was gonna raise about the $150 a night is gross, and after you deduct cleaning services and laundry and all that other stuff, it's not necessarily a huge number after that.
The 18,000 for rental income is also taxed, so you have to
Yeah.
keep that
And
in
there's income
mind.
tax. No, it's income tax.
I'm just gonna go out to the audience to Rod there. Do you have a comment, Glenn?
Yeah,
Quickly.
yeah, I'll try to be quick.
Yeah.
I just, to focus on when we had the opportunity, when Emma came and presented to us in October at the Community Economic Development Committee meeting. And it's reflected in your recommendation, I think, our discussions, which is great. What I wanted to share with council, and I think Maureen and Allison have a flavor of that, is that in our meeting, we were doing a lot of learning and we appreciated the presentation. But I don't think, and I think you said this, that there was discussion, for instance, specifically around the 120-day limit in both directions, but there wasn't, I believe, and I think I'm accurate in reflecting that, any kind of preference to have any kind of limit. And one of the things that we have been reflecting on a lot as a committee is that we now have a community economic development officer who is in the process of putting together a plan. And the things that keep coming up in terms of what are the economic metrics, or what, again, whether it's revenue generated or demand or saturation of demand for destination tourism accommodation. We just don't know, and we don't have the information to be able to really, I think, make accurate decisions, which is why our discussion goes back and forth on the issue as we listen to a presentation. So that being the limit, being the only contentious point, I think, in our discussions within the committee, I think that's worth just focusing on and highlighting that, and I'm not sure that it was reflected in the summary that you did, Emma, that there aren't necessarily short-term stay options on Bowen Island currently. We don't have a hotel or an hotel. We do have retreats and we do have other destination commercially zoned areas, and understand that, but we don't know how booked are they and how much demand is there for that type of accommodation, and how does that affect local economy in our community. So for instance, if someone wants to host a wedding, do they decide not to host it on Boeing because of accommodation? We don't know that, I don't believe. And that's where, again, I just want to highlight that I don't think that we feel that there is a support for an arbitrary number of nights at this point. At least that's my interpretation of our discussion.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so we got to sort of wrap this up. What I'm hearing, the 120-day thing obviously is a little bit of a sensitive point here. And what about the TUP? Is there an availability for the people that, well, there's one that I can think of. If they want to extend that 120 days, can they do it through TUP? What would that look like?
Yes, so people would have the option of either applying for a temporary use permit or a rezoning, and I would probably say that temporary use permit is the more appropriate, because it's sort of, it can happen, council can approve a permit for 3 years and renew it, and they can reapply if it's operating well, and if they continue to operate as that. And essentially it would be a temporary use permit to allow the use of commercial guest accommodation. So it'd be saying this property for this period of time can be used as a commercial guest accommodation. And in that sense, council can then monitor, how many of the entire ones are being used year round in this way, because each one would come as an application to council.
We could also put a limit on it.
Yeah.
And the cost of that?
I think it's $850 for the application, I believe.
So the operator's going to have to pay $850
For 6 years.
For 3 years, and then renewal is a lesser amount. I think it's $350 for a renewal.
It's really nothing in the scale of it. Yeah, hold on, Marie, we gotta sort of wrap this at some point in time, but the other issues I had is the neighborhood agreement, whatever it is, that's gonna have to be negotiated as we go forward here. We have to talk about the terms of that, just the terms of it, that's all. And I think that's a good regulatory thing. I mean, we came into this because A, we wanted to regulate short-term rentals. And I think with the business licensing, I think that's probably the best tool we have to do that. And the other thing was we wanted to, protect our long-term rentals, but I really don't think that it's gonna make that much difference in long-term rental, whatever we do in the short-term rental area. I'd like to know if there's anywhere else besides the TUPs. Can anybody come and say, hey, listen, I'd like to, I guess, sort of, if they have a particular circumstance, like, and I'm thinking of a couple that people have told me about, is there an ability for them to come to council and say, hey, here's my situation, and I don't fit into any of these, and is there any?
That is a temporary use permit, isn't it?
Well, it could end up being a temporary use permit, but
We
not
need to know
necessarily.
the facts, I think, before we can answer that question.
Well, just where they've got some full-time, they've got long-term rental, but they also augmented it with short-term rental on the weekend, because long-term rental doesn't use it all the time. So it's just little, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of different incidents where people treat their rental accommodation a little bit differently. At some point in time, we've got to move forward on this, and I just wonder, there's also a review process built into this after 1 year, wasn't there? that we're gonna look at?
Yes, for the project
Yes.
itself, yes.
Yeah.
After 1 year, staff will report back on results,
Yeah.
the monitoring results.
So, this policy we're committing for perhaps 1 year, it could be changed in a year, but I mean, if we have to change it before that, certainly we can do that too. So I don't know how hung up we want to get on
Will you have
the.
a chance to say anything?
Sorry?
Murray, I think, had his hand.
Yes, I know. So I don't know, how specific we want to get at this point in time. We went through this process before and it ended up being a very long process, and now we're back again going down the same sort of rabbit hole. So I'm thinking that we should somehow try to move ahead. I'm going to go to Murray first, and Daniel, and then back to you, sir.
I'll just, I've got a whole list, but I'll be real quick on two things. Number one, the short-term rentals, the 120 days, in many of the communities that she's talking about, they have hotels, they have
Yes.
accommodation. We do not. Number two, we talk about the MRDT. It's a source of income for the community to, number one, help us, Tourism Bowen Island, to exist.
Yeah.
And number two, it gives money towards affordable housing. Now, you're cutting off a lot of money if you limit those rentals for 120 days. Because these rentals, primarily, they're the ones that I'm concerned about are the ones that aren't ever going to be rented full-time. If it's 120 days, they're going to stay shallow for the other 4 or 5 months, 6 months, whatever it is. They're not going to be rented full-time because the owners want to use them when they want to use them. The other ones are owned by ordinary people who have got ordinary jobs. They want to move to Bowen Island. They get a 3-week vacation a year for their employment, so they're here for 3 weeks. Then they rent them out for the rest of the year so they can pay school taxes, property taxes, municipal taxes, road tax. I had this weekend 2 rental units beside us.
Mm-hmm.
There were 4 people upstairs, 2 people downstairs. They talked about rustique, they talked about getting pizza, they had 1 delivery, they had, they were in the shops in November. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen with 120 days. Those people who want to, maximize their revenues are going to rent them except for their maybe 2 to 3 weeks.
I certainly understand that.
But it's the MRDT that you're cutting off a whole bunch of revenue, and from very high rentals. These are places that are renting for $200, $300 a night. If they were put on the long-term rental market, they'd be rented for $4,000 and $5,000 a month. They would not be rented for $1,800. So,
They're also, they're also making $500 a night.
So, but they're also spending a hell of a lot of money, as Jan pointed out in some of her notes.
Yep, no, I understand that.
She spends tens of thousands, if not close to $100,000.
Why wouldn't she apply for a TUP then?
But $800,
It's nothing. You're making $500 a night, Murray, come on.
no, it's crazy.
Okay.
It's someplace else. Anyway.
Okay, so we gotta move on. Daniel, you had something to say?
I was just going to say in terms of moving forward, so what staff is looking for at the council meeting following this is adoption of the policy, but then direction to prepare the bylaws that would actually make the amendments happen, and that's where some of the details would be looked at. So in terms of council direction, by adopting the short-term rental policy doesn't mean this would happen tomorrow, but it means that we would then be drafting bylaws to bring them to you for readings with the consultation and for the land use bylaw public hearing. So in terms of, it's the end of the policy piece, but then it moves into bylaw drafting and adoption, so there's still a process.
I just wanted to flag that I've got my notes from when Josie Osborne from Tofino came to talk to us and regulating what she called short-term rental somethings. Anyway, was about affordable housing. That's one of the main issues for me, and one of the key considerations there being residents first. I just don't want to sell out our community by having no limits. I just think we need sensible regulation of this use that's happening on land. And so that's what I'm hoping we'll consider in the council meeting. So I'd like to move that the committee of the whole recommend to council. I guess maybe we don't need to, we've already got it on the agenda. Okay.
Okay, anybody else? Murray, I'll give you, sorry, I cut you off, I'll give you about another 30 seconds if you got something to go, and then we'll carry it on. Yeah.
Nope,
All right,
that's good.
okay, Allison?
And I recall the Osborne saying at that meeting that, their regulations and policy really haven't increased their long-term rental stock.
Yeah, that's what she said. No, I don't think
Okay, I'm going to adjourn this committee of the whole, and we'll reconvene here in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much.